Hi, guys. Welcome to Real Food Recovery. We are back today. Very excited to have Dr. Olivardia back for a follow-up interview. We're going to get a little deeper this time on his insights and how ultra-processed food use disorder impacts mental and physical health and some practical steps that we can take on our recovery journey. But first, we have to say hi to Jamie, and she's going to share a little bit more about him. How's it going, sister?
Good, very well. Glad to be here. I was telling Dr. Olivardia before we recorded that, he was kind of like that magical first date that you realize you want a second date with.
Mm-hmm.
He's the magical first date of podcast interviews that I realized I'm like, oh, I'd like to see him again. So we had him back because he, not only is he just a wealth of knowledge, and thought leadership in this topic of ADHD, but he has such a rich history and vulnerable way of sharing his own history with it that I think for me made me really connect with him, connect with his patients, connect with I think the struggle and also the recovery, right? What that looks like for someone struggling with ADHD, and so many folks that Paige and I both know, including each of us, struggles with components of this. So Dr. Roberto Olivardia is a clinical psychologist lecturer in psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and he's also a clinical associate at McLean Hospital. He maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Lexington, Mass, where he specializes in the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and body dysmorphic disorder, BDD. And he also talks and specializes in issues that face students with learning disabilities, which, as you can imagine, all of these sometimes are connected. And he's a nationally recognized expert in eating disorders and body image problems, specifically in boys and men. And this is an area that, again, Dr. Olivardi, I'd love to dig into with you if we have time, because Paige and I, and many of our guests, we live in the world of the female, right? The way that
Mm-hmm.
women show up in the world, or women show up in with processed food, or eating, um, eating issues with food, particularly that those ultra processed food behaviors. What we don't really talk about is how men, how that impacts men, and how men's maybe the lens they wear on the world, how they show up, especially with ADHD. Dr. Olivardia had co-authored a book called The Adonis Complex, and he's appeared in publications such as Time, GQ, Rolling Stone. Has been featured also on Good Morning America, CNN, and VH1. So we are very pleased to have him here. Dr. Olivardia currently serves on a scientific advisory board for children and adults with ADHD, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, ADDA, and Attitude, which is, I guess, a publication. Is that right, Dr. Olivardia?
Yes, it's a magazine and a website that has free podcasts, webinars, articles about ADHD and learning disabilities.
Perfect. So let's launch there. I think it's important. I know you've talked a little bit about it on our first episode, the end of last year, but let's talk a little bit about how all of that links, how ADHD, OCD, BDD, body dysmorphia, and learning disabilities, how does that all link together?
So I think first it's important to know with ADHD that ADHD is not a mental illness. So it's in the DSM as a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Okay.
We really, in the real world, characterize it as a neurodiversity, a way that the brain is wired. Now, that way that the brain is wired can set it up and make things very challenging and frustrating and difficult for people. And if managed and treated, could be that same brain chemistry that lends itself to positive things and positive traits of how people see themselves.
Mhm.
But knowing that that is the way that someone is wired, we're born with ADHD. It's highly genetic, it's highly heritable. And what we know about ADHD is that it rarely travels alone, that most individuals with ADHD have 2 to 3 comorbid or associated disorders. And those would be things like a mood disorder, anxiety disorder, substance abuse, eating disorder. Learning 50 to 60% of people with ADHD have a learning disability, like dyslexia, for example. 20% have a mood disorder, like depression or bipolar spectrum disorders. 30% have an anxiety disorder, such as OCD. If you look at research on people who are in recovery, you'll see a much higher prevalence of people with ADHD than seen in the general population.
Mhm.
So having ADHD fundamentally, one should, in a sense, always be aware of other things that could sort of spring from the ADHD, which is why what I passionately love talking about this, other than the fact that professionally I work with amazing patients who have ADHD. I have ADHD. I have two kids with ADHD and dyslexia. Is that on a clinical level, it's vastly clinically underappreciated from the perspective of how important it is to manage and treat the ADHD, because if it's unmanaged and untreated, it will, not may, but it will undermine the treatment of anything else that's in the midst. And so a lot of times, because ADHD is not couched again as a mental illness, that a lot of times it could be, oh, well, let's treat the bipolar disorder before we treat the ADHD, or let's treat the addiction before we treat the ADHD. And it's like, like that ADHD, you either have to treat it first in some cases, or at the very least simultaneously, because if that ADHD is unmanaged, it's almost like saying to someone, "Oh, well, let's treat the depression before we treat the addiction." But if somebody is totally, high and out of their mind, like they're how are we going to regulate their moods? If anything, we have to kind of attack sort of both at the same time. But ADHD is that thing that when it is treated and managed can make things a lot easier in the treatment of other things such as OCD and BDD. Um, and we
Mhm.
see, as we were talking before, a much higher prevalence of people with ADHD who have bulimia and binge eating disorder. And with something like body dysmorphic disorder, which is something I also specialize in, I see it a lot clinically. Now, the research is starting to look at this correlation and this relationship. There was a recent study that found in a sample of people with BDD that the people with BDD were twice as likely to have ADHD than the people who did not have body dysmorphic disorder. I see it a lot for a number of reasons. I think one is for a lot of people with ADHD, knowing that it's this issue of executive functioning, it can be very difficult for people with ADHD to sometimes get things done, to feel successful in many ways. And when, when we think about, similarly to how we talk about eating disorders as a issue sometimes of control, that I can't control X, Y, and Z in the world, but I can control what I eat, what I don't eat in the case of an eating disorder. But in the case of body dysmorphic disorder, I can manage and control my appearance. And if I look perfect, whatever that may mean,
Yeah.
then everything, it will immunize me from stress and social rejection and all of these things. And of course, we know that's not true at all. So I think there's that. There's the other element, though, is people with ADHD, we can get very hyper focused on anything that is stimulating to us. Now, that stimulation could be something that's not always good for us. Like we could be hyper focused on our appearance, for example, and really notice the small imperfections and flaws and mirror checking and those kinds of
Oh,
behaviors
yes.
that can lend itself to body dysmorphic disorder. So it's this hyper focused, highly stimulating activity. And some of my patients, I mean, we know this with BDD, but especially when ADHD is in the mix, some of my patients will say, yes, I was mirror checking for like 5 hours. I was taking selfies, over hours
Okay.
and hours, seeing what is the best angle, what's the best lighting of how I
Wow.
look. And that's highly charged. It's very, even though it's not pleasant for people, who
Well,
are
especially in
struggling.
this social media landscape. I mean,
Yeah,
talk about highly charged because you're literally getting immediate feedback.
100%.
Right.
I
Exactly.
mean, which can
And
be devastating or reinforcing.
exactly. And that's the
Sure.
another word is that people with ADHD, we we're looking for the quickest reinforcement possible. We're not patient with our with our reinforcement and impact. And you're right, with social media, and this is something that, having worked in this field, 30 years now, pre-social media and post in
Ah, what a
working.
difference. What is it?
Wow.
Yeah,
For body image, like working in the eating disorder BDD field, I can tell you that the presence of social media is like an accelerant. I mean, like what it has done in the negative in terms of, like, yeah, you take a picture pre-social media. It's like, okay, take a picture. And a lot of my patients with BDD or eating disorders might avoid picture taking, and we'll do exposures where they take a picture, but the picture is just, it exists in a photo album that maybe no one would
right,
see.
right. Or in a drawer,
Nowadays,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. Nowadays, you take a picture, and it's not even like a picture. You could have a picture taken of you that you're not even
right,
aware that you're
right,
in it. So now my patients who have BDD, when they leave the house, sometimes it almost fuels more of that obsession because they're thinking, oh my gosh, well, I could have a picture and then it could be on somebody's account somewhere and it's there forever. And I don't want people to see if they think I'm ugly, because with people with BDD have this, they think that they look ugly or disfigured in ways. So yeah, social media has really done a number, and it doesn't help, of course, that yes, you get feedback, and sometimes that feedback is horrendous. I mean, it's just
right.
awful.
Yeah,
Like they're
horrific.
just horrific,
Mhm.
people that just want to be nasty and mean, um and then, or even like the positive feedback. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that in looking at the literature on the impact of even like the body positivity sort of movement, like in social media, like people posting, whether it's people in larger bodies or smaller bodies or whatever, even if they're posting like, hey, I'm proud of my body, the fact is research shows that that still objectifies the body, that it's still telling people that bodies are important, that we need feedback from. And so it's a very tough landscape, because, even when people are praised, like, you look great, you look, wonderful. And then that is very reinforcing. And to an ADHD brain, especially where we're craving dopamine, that reinforcement is very dopaminergic.
Of
It's,
course.
and then it's like, well, now what do I
And
post
immediate, and
next?
immediate. I mean, it's immediate, which also like
Immediate.
it
Yes.
creates, I found it creates like that that need for another hit and another hit, and that not only the intensity of it, but the speed and
Yes.
the length of time in between those hits is much shorter. And then I look at the way the brain, the child's brain, especially, right, under
Mm,
21, this child's brain is developing, and they're looking for that rapid hit, 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 hit. And they can't, like, what do they do when they get out in the, in the world? And I don't
100%.
even know.
And to, a developing brain for an ADHD person is up to their late 20s, so up to
Right,
30.
right.
And it's yeah, I mean, and as we know, with social media, there's an algorithm that is designed to keep you on there. And as I told my kids, because my kids were later than their peers were in getting social media, and I was pretty strict on that. And I've told them, we all have ADHD. I'm like, look, I'm only doing this because I know if I had this, forget about it. It would have, it would have, it wouldn't have been like even a question in my mind that this would have been a major problem. Like, and my kids know, because, my parents, who are no longer with us, but they met, they knew my parents before they passed. And my parents were very frugal. It was all about saving money for college and education. I had one television in my house. It was a black and white TV until I think I was in high school. We got a color TV. And I was, typical middle class family,
Yeah,
but immigrant parents were, it was like, nope, you don't need an Atari. Like all of my friends had the video games. And then I was literally like, by the time I got an Atari, it was like people were moved on to Nintendo,
yeah, Nintendo.
But it worked in that I was never into video games. I'm not good at them. My parents didn't get cable till I went to college. And this is all, and I have to credit, and I always praise them. They were amazing, because no one knew we had ADHD, like at that time. Like they
Right. Sure.
intuitively knew that when I'm begging for MTV, like my life depended on it, that they probably thought, yeah, no, this is probably not
Smart,
going to be good. And I
smart.
learned from that enough that when I went and had my first apartment and was in graduate school, I did not get cable until the day I defended my dissertation on my way home from defending my
You
dissertation,
you called and activated?
yep, I'm on the phone with Comcast to be like, let's set up that cable. But even having cable would have been too much. Forget about it. If I had YouTube, if I had, it would have been bad. Like it just, it's almost like design. It's like really like crack on an ADHD brain.
Before we move to Paige's question, I want to just recap for the audience who may have not seen your first interview. PS, go back and watch it if you haven't, guys. But Dr. Olivardia, when you talked about a few minutes ago, treatment, you mentioned that term treatment. Talk about, again, just recap for our listeners, what treatment protocols and plans include.
For ADHD?
Yes.
Yeah, so for ADHD, you have so first the pharmacological treatments, and those are typically stimulant medications. There are non-stimulants as well, but stimulants is usually the first line approach. And for anyone who has concerns about that, it's important to know, number one, they are one of the oldest classes of medications used. They are one of the most heavily researched. We have data on people in their 70s and 80s who have taken stimulants for many, many years and decades. They are, when prescribed, taken as prescribed, safe. For people with ADHD, actually, there's a very, very low risk of addiction. In fact, I've never worked with a patient with ADHD who's been addicted in taking their prescription, because and the joke in the ADHD community is that if they are so addictive, none of my patients would ever forget taking their medication. And a lot of them do, or forget to fill it or call the, prescriber. They're very trial friendly. So, the day, if not 2 days, when you take it, what they're going to do. So, and if you have side effects, they don't work, you're with your prescriber's recommendations, you go off it, and within a couple of days you can start another one. And it can take up to 4 to 5 different medication trials to find one, because there are a lot of different stimulants, and
Right.
it really is trial and error for what works for you as an individual. So
Mhm.
that's the medication piece. Now, the pills don't teach the skills. So
That's
we
right.
need the medication, and not everyone with ADHD takes medication. Some people don't. Sometimes the medications also can, unfortunately, interact with some of the comorbid disorders in a way that might not be helpful. So but again, even
Weight
that,
loss, weight gain in this
yeah.
context.
Or sometimes, like, there are people with ADHD and anxiety where the stimulants exacerbate the
Exacerbate
anxiety. And then
anxiety.
other times it does the opposite. Because the person is properly grounded, they're almost better able to work against the anxiety. Then you have more sort of the executive functioning, kind of coaching, training work, developing strategies around those executive function issues of time management and organization and memory and all of that. And things like cognitive behavioral therapy to deal with negative thought patterns,
Sure.
DBT, mindfulness skills, all of that. And then just like health hygiene is a big part of the work I do with patients: sleep, eating, exercise, all of those things that help regulate anyone. But those are all issues that are highly impacted also by ADHD.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I have a couple, I have two little quick mini questions, but and then I have a bigger question. We were talking before we started recording, and you said the proper terminology is ADHD versus ADD.
Yep.
Is there ever a point, do we grow out as we age? Do we age out of the H?
It's a great question. So, first is just to give you some historical context, that it wasn't until, which is kind of funny to me, the mid 90s, that ADHD was even acknowledged in adults. Like the idea, like it was almost like, what, on your 18th birthday, it just like goes away? Like what happens to it? So the idea of adults having ADHD is fairly, new. Um, and yes, so to your point, when we say ADD, really the clinical term is ADHD, but one can have more what they call a predominantly inattentive presentation, predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, or combine. And the
Gotcha.
reason they call it all ADHD now is that there may be some differences of manifestations, but in terms of treatment, in terms of a lot of the executive function issues, it's pretty much the same. And also with the inattentive types, it's not, their hyperactivity might not be behavioral or motoric, but they may have like mental
Mental,
hyperactivity,
right.
and which can look like anxiety. It can look like ruminative depression, and it's a little bit different, than that. Now, the other question is, do we age out of it? So there was a question, and this is still sometimes talked about, like, do we outgrow ADHD, period? And it turns out no, that's not the case. The difference is that because ADHD, and this is again the difference of not looking at it from like an illness model, because like depression, for example, is fairly consistent. Like if someone is depressed, they are constitutionally different than when they're not depressed. And when they're not depressed, they're like, whoa, how I was thinking, feeling, looking at the world when I'm depressed is so different than how I look at it when I'm not depressed. And it's consistent in that people, when they're depressed, they don't find pleasure in anything, for example. With ADHD, it's not that way, in that it's so contextual. How it's going to manifest is going to depend on your environment, what supports are in place, the level of stimulation in place. So there's a study actually that was recently done, and I love when these studies are done, because now we have empirical data to back up the clinical data and lived experience, that showed that people with ADHD did not have this consistent level of impairment, for example, that it really waxed and waned depending upon what was happening and going on in their lives. So if somebody was at a job that just was a really bad fit, you're going to see more of those ADHD symptoms. If people are
Mhm.
in work, like I am, in a work that is like a key to a lock, that is, I'm truly never bored at what I do. Like, I mean, how awesome. Like, I literally am
Yeah.
like, I am always like, because I'm working with a different person every hour. I specialize in different things. Like, I love it. Like, I love people. I love learning. So I'm never bored. So that's going to hold a lot of ADHD symptoms at play. Now,
Right.
if you saw me in school, in high school, you
Right.
would have, I mean, it's a totally different story,
Right.
because that would have looked very different.
Hmm.
So it's not that we outgrow it, it's that we have more options after 18. And the
Hmm.
hope is that if people understand their ADHD, accept it, and then avail themselves to strategies, and more importantly, find that right fit for them, then it's going to be different. And to your question about hyperactivity, there are studies that show that it can attenuate a little bit. But again, that's debatable. Is it that, so for example, I can take, speak personally, that one could say, okay, well, I'm less hyper than I was because as a kid, I might have to get up and go to the go, quote unquote, go to the bathroom just to walk around and, move around and whatnot. But I don't feel constitutionally different than I did when I was younger. It's just that
Mm.
that hyperactive energy is just funneled and grounded in this stimulating framework that I sort of work under. But
Hmm.
if I'm in a different setting, then like when I met with my accountant a couple weeks ago, she's great, but oh my gosh, those meetings are like, I feel like I'm in third grade all over
Painful.
again.
Yeah. Right. Painful.
Painful. And it is a 30-minute meeting, and I have to stand up, I have to fidget, I have to like, oh my gosh, I'm like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And she's so nice telling me this stuff. And I'm like, I really don't care. Like, just
Right.
tell me where
Bottom
to
line is for me.
sign.
Yeah.
Let's just do it. And all of that can come back like
Hmm.
easily. And so it's not that we really grow out of it. It's just that we're better and hopefully gravitating to environments that just kind of couch and funnel that.
Love that answer. Love that answer. And I have just a little follow-up question to that before I get to my big question. But so we don't grow out of ADD ever. In fact, I mean, I almost feel like my ADD sometimes is worse than when I was a
Oh,
kid. I can't read a paragraph without having to go back and go, now what happened?
yeah, I
So
can tell you that my tolerance for boredom is far worse than it's ever. I mean, it's like,
okay,
now again, part of that is that that's a muscle that I don't work at, because thankfully I'm not bored very often
yeah,
because I put myself in
interesting.
those situations.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
yes, there are aspects that people with ADHD were like, yeah, this part, like reading comprehension and those kinds of things, can get harder and or more challenging.
yeah. Okay, thank you. That clears up so much. So my question is, GLP-1s are all the rage right now for people with food
Yeah.
addiction. And I'm I'm not knocking it. And I'm sure it has its right place for certain scenarios. So, for instance, there is new conversation about people just that don't necessarily want to lose weight, and they are focusing on what's called microdosing. So it's just to keep kind of the brain chatter, help with the brain part of the addiction, to keep it quiet. Does that also then, if somebody is taking a microdose, not to lose weight, but just to quiet the brain, is that also effective on the ADD? Would that work in place of ADD medication? Like would it kill two birds with one stone?
No, there's no research that would show. Now, it's interesting with that because I haven't seen any research yet with ADHD and these new sort of weight loss medications. But no, that wouldn't necessarily target ADHD symptoms. Now, whether could that help people with ADHD who have food issues and whatnot?
Yes.
That remains to be seen. I mean, what I know is that when there have been studies done over the years of people with ADHD who get gastric bypass surgery and
Mhm.
find that when it's the ADHD is if it's not treated, those individuals that are higher risk of gaining the weight back, and sometimes having even more medical complications post surgery. So I
Sure.
give talks and do consultations with bariatric clinics and tell them you must screen for ADHD because these are the patients, if they're not screened, and studies show that a lot of adults who present at these bypass clinics, gastric bypass clinics, when they are screened, that I think it was like one study found that 60% of those adults didn't even realize that they had ADHD. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
untreated ADHD, and it's in everyone's best interest to sort of understand that because then those are the patients that, are, again, if it's not managed, they're going to gain the weight back. They're going to gain it back in places that they might not have even had it in the first place,
Oh, sure.
and could have more medical complications because it's still an
And
impulsivity issue.
Yeah.
right. And that's why I wonder if that relates to why a lot of bariatric surgery patients will transfer that obesity, many of them over to alcoholism.
That's exactly right. And I've seen that addiction transfer, and I've seen it in both ways. I've seen recovering alcoholics and drug
Oh,
users who
oh,
develop
everywhere.
binge eating disorders. I've seen it in that way. And then when they realize, oh, wait a minute, and that's the other thing is I want people to understand it's not an issue of like willpower, these terms that, make people feel less than or feel weak,
Right.
and as opposed to the reality is we're not all on the same equal page when it comes to addiction risk, that it's like it's when I meet someone who has never eaten like a large pizza by themselves, I'm like, who are you? Like, what? Like,
Right.
how does that happen? Like when
How's
I
your
meet,
time? How's your
yeah,
time on this planet gone so
yeah,
far?
like when I meet
Yeah.
people who have never pulled an all-nighter, I'm like, what? Like, how? It's just, but that's the experience of like, oh, or people that like I don't know, even like in positive ways when like I love music and when someone's like, oh yeah, I kind of like music, but it's not. Meanwhile, I'm like the bands I'm into, I'm obsessed with. Like I can tell you everything like about them, and that's sort of my nature in that way. So that can lend itself to great experiences, and it can lend itself to these addictive behaviors that I have to be careful about. And so when I work with patients who have had, who are in recovery for a drug problem, who then eating disorder, gambling addiction, and then they see themselves as just, oh, I'm just an quote unquote addict, or a loser and all of these negative, and then they understand ADHD and they're like, oh, wait a minute. So this is all coming from the same well, basically, and then they get proper treatment of it. And as we know from studies that proper treatment of ADHD, you see less relapse, better adherence to sobriety, all of that. Then it's enlightening to people to be like, oh, okay, this makes sense now.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that. Thank you for talking about that.
So one of the things that we wanted you to talk a little bit about, that we found very interesting was your work with men and young men, children, boys specifically.
Mm.
when we think, Paige and I, again, like I mentioned earlier, we have this sort of focus on in women and women in recovery from processed food use disorder and even eating disorders in general.
Mhm.
But a lot of men don't necessarily think about their connection to, certain behaviors and ADD or ADHD. They don't think about their connection um to maybe even addiction and
Mhm.
ADHD. So how, and we, and I, Paige and I both know that, I've coached men in my coaching practice, but they have a very different lens on life.
Mhm.
So how does your experience dovetail with this
Mm.
and your research?
Yeah. So this started actually when I was an undergraduate in college. So I was 19 taking a class on eating disorders. I was mildly interested in it. I mean, at that time, my main focus that I thought I would specialize in was childhood trauma and children who physical and sexual abuse. And I do work with a lot of people who have trauma histories. And this class was a 3 hour block. I thought, oh, this will be interesting. Loved it. I loved what fascinated me, particularly about eating disorders, was here was this psychiatric disorder that intersected so much with culture and sort of how that sort of morphed, kind of over history. So coincidentally, two male college students who I didn't know super well, who did not know each other, just in conversation, and I always kind of have the experience where people are, which is very nice, like just open up to me about certain things. And one had told me that he had suffered from bulimia for years, binging and purging, and the other one said he thought he was anorexic. He was restricting and my nature is to want to help people, and this is pre-internet. So
Mhm.
going through the yellow pages, I have to explain that to my younger patients what that is. They're like, "What?" I'm like, it's like
Not even
Google
a
in
website
paper
anymore.
form. And I was looking for any support groups, eating disorder, and I would call them up, and none of them accepted men at the time. So
Wow,
that
I didn't know
started,
that.
yeah, none of them. They were like, oh, this is just for women only. And I
Wow.
understood that. And I also thought, well, shouldn't we have at least one, group? So that started because I'm always interested in my work of filling gaps of knowledge and like what don't we know about? And even in our conversation today, like the gaps of connecting dots of different diagnoses. So my first study was my senior honors thesis at Tufts University, where I went to college, and I didn't even know this at the time, but it was the first controlled study looking at men with eating disorders that had drawn men from the community as opposed to clinical samples, which had, obviously are a selection of a certain kind of guy, the guy that is hospitalized. So I put them in college, and I'm in Massachusetts, where we have a lot of colleges that are a stone's throw away from. So is and I remember my thesis committee said, "This is great, but you might need a plan B because who knows if you're going to get enough men like calling, who satisfy the DSM at that
Yeah,
time, the
yeah.
DSM-4 criteria." Well, I did not need a plan B. I had guys calling, and I wish I had saved the answering machine tape, the little cassette tape,
Yep.
but they were guys. I mean, we were paying subjects to be part of the study, and some of them were like, I don't even need the money. Like, I can't believe someone's actually studying this. I thought I was literally the only person.
Yeah.
Guy in tears. I mean, it was so moving. And then I'd bring these guys in, interview them, they do all these questionnaires. And I was the first person that I would say most of these college students had even disclosed that they had an eating disorder. And then
Incredible.
that went from that continuing in grad school and then looking at men with body dysmorphic disorder and then a specific type of BDD. And we coined this term muscle dysmorphia, which is now actually in the DSM,
Okay.
which is pretty cool.
Okay.
And muscle dysmorphia is a subtype of body dysmorphic disorder and it's predominantly men, although there's some women that could have it,
Mhm.
who are quite muscular and big, but they think they look too small. So if you almost think
Yep.
of a reverse of anorexia, basically,
Sure. Yeah.
and they're obsessed with working out and lifting weights, they
Mhm.
eat, but they eat in very ritualistic, obsessive,
Oh,
compulsive.
are they? And they also, I'm sure, compete in all kinds of bodybuilding, the
Yes. Oh,
bodybuilding.
the bodybuilding world, absolutely filled with, people with muscle dysmorphia. And so then we started looking at that aspect. And so that culminated in my colleagues and I, we wrote a book in 2000, which I can't believe that was 25 years ago, called The Adonis Complex, that we looked at basically everything that's talked about with girls and women, everything from media imagery like the Barbie doll. We did a study on male action figures and found that a lot of them, if they were real life human males, would be unrealistic or unrealistic without the use of steroids in terms of muscularity.
Mhm.
We looked at cosmetic surgery, eating disorders, steroid use, compulsive weightlifters. So that whole realm. And what we know is that with men, what's interesting is that a couple things really differ in terms of the role that body image plays. With men, there's a big, with women, I should say, feeling as if you have more body fat than you do is a risk factor, and having feelings about that is a risk factor for an eating disorder. So,
Mm-hmm.
whereas for men, we find it could go either way. So,
Yeah.
men who are either quote unquote too big,
Mhm.
but also men who were seen as too skinny. So a
Mhm.
lot of the patients I work with were bullied for being too skinny,
Oh
because
yeah,
being skinny for a boy is
is the
associated with
equivalent.
being weakness. And in this, gendered world we live in, that's not masculine, if you don't have those muscles. So it can go in either of those directions. And for men, it's not about being overweight as much as it's being over fat. And so with, like, if you take bodybuilders, they're overweight by
Right.
Or oh,
nature,
clinical
but
standards, right?
right, but they're not over fat. Like they might have like 5% body fat. And the role that muscle and sort of definition and all of that plays a much bigger role. But I think, to your point, what's also interesting in working with this population, although this is changing, and this is, I guess, one of the upsides, the positive part, I would say, about social media, is that,
Mhm.
you can have a boy or a young person, maybe hear the lived experience of somebody else, in a much more accessible way than maybe years ago.
That's right. That's right.
So that's the upside. But men in general are socialized in ways to not really pay attention to their bodies. So
Cool.
women are almost socialized to pay too much attention to the aesthetic aspects of their body. And men, meanwhile, are like, oh no, don't pay attention to your pain.
Right.
Going,
Yeah.
like, men are less likely to
Neck
get,
down.
yep,
Yeah. Disconnect.
yeah. Men are less likely to get annual physical exams, are, less likely to go to a doctor at the first signs of pain. So there's this sense of, even when we talk about body image, that's like not as quickly sort of access. Like sometimes when I ask, and this is even with boys I work with, body, they're like, oh, I don't know, I just want to look this way. And then even them thinking that they have a feeling about their body is almost already feels emasculating in some ways, to them, like shaming, like they're quote
Ah,
unquote like a girl.
that makes
And
so much sense.
and of course, there's a lot of discussion we have around, well, being like a girl is not, it isn't a problem, because there's a lot of sort of that kind of sexism and misogyny sort of in there. But it's that sense of, oh, even like, I remember doing research studies. This was, in the early 2000s. And I noticed if I even put body image in the ad to recruit male subjects,
Sure.
I would hardly get anybody. So if I would say something like, are you dissatisfied with your progress at the gym or
Mhm.
something? Then I would have guys calling me. But if I said, do you have
Wow.
negative body image?
Oh, forget it.
Nope. No one's going to call me on that,
Yeah.
because even that term at that time, a little less so now, became so, it's so gendered,
Yeah.
in that kind of way. So there's this
Wow.
real disconnect around that. But yeah, and then you place, and I see this a lot. I mean, the prevalence of ADHD, and the guys with muscle dysmorphia, and again, then you're talking about compulsive exercise, which can also be endorphin and dopaminergic and sense of
Totally.
control and all that. So it's always important to screen all of the players that are sort of on the stage, diagnostically when I'm working with someone.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's really incredible. And I've seen, just again, and this is anecdotal, but I know many men in the world of recovery who come from alcohol and some drug, but mostly alcohol background, and they connect in with, they do have a really good experience in their alcohol recovery. Really good experience. They can, for them, cutting alcohol is easy, done. They're there, they're sober, they're a member of the community. They really connect with the service aspect of it, and they connect with the world of recovery. Like, it becomes part of who they are, and it's
Yes.
beautiful to watch. I
I
love.
I similarly feel that way.
And then I'll watch these same strong men, many of them old timers in the world of AA, or recovery, and leaders of others, right? And informal or otherwise, and they will struggle with food. They will
Hmm.
struggle with body image. They will struggle to accept their medical diagnoses that they get. Um, and they will even get, one of my good friends, an amazing leader in recovery, and leads and sponsors many men, who came after him, and he is struggling now to accept what his, medical tests and doctors are telling him about, like, his health risks are extremely, they're precarious right now around
Mm.
his cardiovascular function. And he is struggling to accept it because he's like, wait a second. I have this identity around my recovery and who I am and how I'm able to live in the world, but I can't apply those same, um that same abstinence model to food. I can't
That's right.
apply that same model of success that I have around alcohol and alcohol recovery to my food, and it's taking me down. And
Yes.
I watch so many of these men in recovery sort of crumble. And it has sent some of the, I don't know them personally, but I've heard that they've gone back out in their old drinking behaviors.
Oh,
Mm.
So
Yeah.
so I guess, that brings me back to this whole idea of identity. How do you address, and especially with these men and boys, how do you address this whole idea of identity shift?
Mm. Yeah. So, and I to dovetail on that I worked with many men with ADHD, and women with ADHD who are in recovery for a drug or alcohol problem, who similarly are very active in AA and wonderfully mentoring other people and sponsoring other people.
Mm.
And I can safely say, like, and then a number of them may develop an eating disorder, and all of them, not one, but all of them have said, as difficult, and we all know, I mean, how
Yes.
difficult it is to overcome, to be in sobriety from a drug or alcohol problem. But, and these are the folks with ADHD say the food issue is a whole other animal, because with ADHD, we can be very all or nothing. And that could work against us in some ways, and it can kind of work for us in other ways. And abstinence is one of those things. Like, some of my patients with ADHD, they're like, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And
Mhm.
so I just stopped. And
That's it.
and for some of my patients with ADHD, it literally was like cold turkey in a way that people are like, what? Like, how did that happen? But food, and this is the core issue with ADHD, is one of regulation of everything. And so food, we have to eat every day. And now that requires executive function and regulation. And that's a different muscle than just stopping, something.
Right.
And
That's right.
I
It's
say
much more
just,
nuanced.
and we all know that that's not as easy as, the just, but that's an important thing. And as far as identity, that um, well, coming from the ADHD perspective, I would say that there's definitely an identity that people with ADHD have about themselves. And we always, and obviously, what I want to encourage is that to be sort of a more strength based identity. And for anyone, for example, I might have mentioned last time, there's an international conference on ADHD every year. It's in November, and it's sponsored by CHAD, which is Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Highly recommend for people who are listening, if you have ADHD, if you're a teacher who teaches students with ADHD, or a
Oh, yeah.
clinician, it's parents, it's everybody. It's not just this, it's not a stuffy professional conference by any means. There are very professional talks, but it is a community of people. This year it's in Kansas City, Missouri. It travels every year. So,
Paige, there you
yep.
go.
I could be there.
That
Okay.
can't be far from you.
Highly recommend it. Last year was in Anaheim, California. So we try to do West Coast, Mid, and East Coast. And what people really, I mean, aside from the talks and all of that they get from that, is this sense of community and this more strength-based identity of,
Connection.
oh, this is who I am. And rather than looking at it through this pathological lens, it's to me almost looking at it in like a Buddhist lens, because it
Mhm.
just, even in the ADHD community, sometimes they talk about ADHD being a gift and whatnot. I'm more
So
of the
Buddhist like acceptance, when you mean
and
Buddhism, like
acceptance.
acceptance
Yeah.
and
Like I'm more the belief that it's not like this gift and it's not a curse. It just is, like almost this sort of like just is. But what's so powerful for me personally of this identity is I understand myself so well through that lens. And it's very helpful to know, like, these are situations, like I can anticipate what's going to be difficult for me because I know I have ADHD, and
Yeah.
these are the things that are going to work well for me because of the ADHD.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important identity. And for a lot of us with ADHD, and I don't think everybody has to see it this way, but for me personally, I feel like I am like ADHD. Like I am it. It's not like I have this thing. Like it is just who I am, and in so many different factors. But it's
Mhm.
not something that I look through a lens of shame around. It's actually through a lens of like, this is it. Like this is how I'm oriented to the world.
Powerful.
And it's very powerful for me, like in that way. And knowing that there are strengths that come along with that, and then these are the things
Or
I have to be careful, about, and
yeah,
things that are going to be challenging as a result of that.
yeah.
And that, I think, is an important sort of piece, as opposed to like when people get into identities of, especially when it's wrapped up in like body image and things like that, like I am a good person because I look this way or weigh this much or this. That's where it's almost like a false identity. Like that's not our true sort of identity and value system and whatnot, versus what we want our identity to be is what's connected to how I'm oriented and how I want to be in the world. And for me with ADHD, it's understanding that how I am in the world is based on that, and then there are the values that sort of spring from that in that way.
Beautiful. Paige, I just have a quick, I was laughing, thinking about this, giggling. Dr. Olivardia, you're talking about who you are, right? When I first met you, I guess it was earlier this year, very early this year,
Mm.
now that I think about it. But anyway, I met with you. I did my qualifiers, I did those I guess tests or assessments, and
Mm.
they were coming back all positive and squarely positive, not just a. And I remember, I sat down with my husband and I told him about you and the interview and how I took the assessments and yada yada. And I was like, so, it looks like, this is what I'm dealing with. He's like, yeah. Like, he didn't, he's like, I know. And so then I kind of made a joke about it. And I just said, is with my diagnosis, I might show up with this or that. And he's like, what really? Are we doing this now? Are we saying like, he's like,
Yeah.
you, and he actually, he is that traditional kind of, I don't know about traditional, but he is that type of guy that like has like could care less,
Mm.
what's happening below the neck. Like there's,
Yeah.
I am who I am and it is what it is. Like he's that guy.
Yeah.
But he also is very accepting of me. Like he's,
Mm.
in many ways. Uh, and that I find, while we certainly have our ups and downs, that never changes with him, which is so
Mm.
interesting to me that
Yeah.
he's, yeah, yeah, I could have, if somebody had asked me, do you think that she has this? I would say, well, of course. Like
Yeah.
he's
Well,
in the twice about it. And he didn't,
Again,
he
yeah, I'm sorry.
didn't think about it as this is you as this with this thing. He's like, that's
Yes.
just you.
It's just you. Well, I mean, this is another thing that is great, if you're at the conference, is we have a really good sense of humor within the community, as we should. And one of them is ADHD is the worst kept secret. Like that's it really is. Like even for
Yeah.
people who are not diagnosed, and I could tell you my experience when I was in my early 30s when I was like officially diagnosed, it was not a oh my gosh, like this big epiphany. Because I have a very visual, I think in very visual ways. I remember the visual I had was putting on a pair of gloves that just fit. And it was like, yeah, like it was like, of course I do. Like similarly how your husband responded to you, that's how I responded to myself when I was like, yeah, of course. And then
Yeah.
looking in my family and I'm like, yeah, of course, my mother and looking at my siblings and looking at my kids because this is also very highly, and that's the other thing, if you have ADHD,
Oh yeah.
know that if you have a child, the chances are much higher than not, like 70% or higher, that they're going to have one of them will have ADHD. If you have two kids, about a 33% chance both will have ADHD. It's a strong gene.
Mhm.
And that's important again because then as a parent, like I could tell you, I diagnosed my son in the womb pretty much because he was so active and I'm like, get ready. Like I told my wife, like it's so strong of a genetic that
Yeah,
but that also means from the get-go, I can parent to that and
totally.
understand that. And if you are happen to be the parent that doesn't have ADHD, but your spouse, your partner does, that means you can read up on ADHD. You can understand that your child, like I remember when my son was 3, 4, I put him in gymnastics class so he can, run around. And so here are all these like cool trampolines. And his first gymnastics teacher, who I could tell was not ADHD, would have all the kids in like a circle time for like 10 minutes,
Oh.
10 minutes, like before
At
going.
three
I'm
years
like,
old? No.
at 3, I'm like, come on. And my son is like, he's like, and he was like not a disrespectful kid. He was just super. And I'd be like, okay. And then I would say to him, I'd whisper in his ear, trust me, I want to be on those trampolines
Right.
too. Like, I was not
Mhm.
the parent that's like, come over here, like, oh, like as if like I'm the bad parent because my kid isn't sitting still. I'm thinking, yeah, like what's wrong with
Wouldn't want
these
to be
kids
over
that
there.
that they want to sit down? Like
Right.
these are cool trampolines here. So that's the very beginning because the truth is that the average person with ADHD hears like it's an astronomical number of like 10,000 extra negative messages, like in a lot of negative messaging, in sometimes very subtle ways and in sometimes very direct ways about somehow that the way they are and who they are is somehow like quote unquote wrong or
Oh
disrespectful or
yes, that
that
was
sort of
that was the
thing.
message I got, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then he had and she was nice, the first gymnastics teacher, but she would like and she'd be easily rattled by him. And he's just a super high energy. And we would get on that trampoline because I could go on it too, because
Oh
that,
yeah.
the parents are involved. I'm like, yeah, we're gonna jump high. And then he got a new gymnastics teacher who we loved and hasn't been confirmed, but I'm convinced that she had ADHD. And she knew how to harness that energy and work. And I was like, yes, like this is so
Mm.
every other class, I'm like, I want her to be the
Right.
teacher.
Yeah.
And when you're a parent and you know that from the get-go, you can funnel, and it's like, and
Yeah.
so it doesn't inherently have to be part of the ADHD experience to have low self-esteem. It's not inherently part of
No,
the
no,
ADHD
that's all
experience.
taught. Unfortunately, that's all
It's
taught.
right. It's all in how the culture responds to you and then how, parents, and again, and I'm not blaming parents because sometimes you
No,
don't know what you don't
you don't know
know.
exactly.
But once you know, oh my gosh, the power of that and what you can then shield and protect your kids from and saying like, yeah, like, because it makes a big difference when you have a parent that's like, yeah, I get it. Why that's hard to like sit still in that. And we still have to figure out ways to do that
Yeah,
because they're going to be, it's not excusing because yeah, you're going to have to sit in a classroom and what are strategies that we can use for it. But if you start with the validation, oh my gosh, like that's almost, I mean, 80% of it is right there, so someone doesn't feel like they're alone in that.
Beautiful.
Well, you have to come back again because I need to ask you another question about, I want to talk more about like for us with the food on the food addiction spectrum, when the brain feels agitated, how can we allow the gut and the brain to communicate so it doesn't feel like the house is on fire, it's an emergency. I
Yeah.
have to eat the cookie or I'm going to die. Hopefully you can help us
Yeah.
with navigating how to comfort the brain. Is it, I'll just ask this real fast. Is when time's moving real slowly, is that when the brain starts getting agitated with the ADD? Is that the thing that kind of flares it up?
Yeah, so basically boredom is the most dysphoric state for someone with
Yes.
ADHD.
Yep.
First and
Yep.
foremost, more
Yes.
dysphoric than anxiety. I
Oh,
mean,
I'm
and
terrified of boredom.
and there was a study, again, I geek out on these studies because I love when it's empirically shown, that was recently done that found that people with ADHD versus people without ADHD, and when engaged in a task that they rated as boring and unstimulating, that the ADHD group, they found that, I'm laughing because it's so true, that receptors in the brain that are implicated in physical pain were being
Yeah.
activated in
Yes.
boredom.
Yes. I
And
know. I feel like I'm being tortured if I'm bored.
yes, and
It's
when I
excruciating.
was a kid, and even as an adult, I would talk in such hyperbolic, dramatic language when I was bored. But and people would be like, "Okay, that's a little dramatic." Like I remember my mom said, "How was your day at school?" And I'm like, I felt like I was dragging like a wounded, bloody
Yeah,
animal throughout
yeah,
the
yeah.
desert. And she's like, "Whoa, okay, that's a little bit dramatic." But I, I
Now
didn't know.
you're my people. You're my
Yeah,
people.
like to just say I was
Oh,
bored didn't
right.
cut it. Like
No,
it's almost like, telling your kid I
no.
love you. It's like I tell my kids I love you seems so, it's so more
Inadequate.
profound. Like, yeah, it's so inadequate, like to the vastness of what I feel. Boredom is that same thing. And when I read that study, it was like, yes, thank you, researchers, for doing that study, because that little that soundbite right there, for listeners, I'm sure, of this podcast, to hear that, to be like, oh, okay. And for loved ones to hear, oh, wow. So it's not that my spouse kid is being like dramatic, when they're like they
Oh,
really
yes.
are agitated when they're bored. Like, wow, like that, this is so neurologically based and wired. So yeah, so that's but we can definitely delve into that
Yeah, because that's
next time.
boredom is like I would rather take a beating than be bored. It's that painful. I guess it'd
Yeah.
be equal to having a beating. So from what you're saying. So thank you so
Yes, it was
much.
great being
Yes,
here
we'll
again.
have to do it again. Time goes
Yes.
way fast when we're together.
Yes, yes. Dr. Olivardia, will you see me again? Will you see
Yes.
Paige and me again?
I'll be back.
We're dating now. We're all dating. And you can't leave us. We'll find you.
Wow. Okay, well, I just want to leave it at we'll have you back.
Yes, yes. I'll gladly be back. It was a lot of fun.
Yes.
Thanks, guys,
Okay.
for joining us. And if you want to find out more about us, you can find us at realfoodrecovery4u.com. That's the number 4 and the letter U. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Thanks.